Then let's start. So again, good morning to everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the Cannes Film Market to have allowed us to have this event again this year. Thank you to Jérôme Paya and his team. We have, as every year, tried to find a topic which we hope will stimulate discussion and will certainly be an important topic for you. Now, in the current times of austerity, you are not surprised we are talking about financing of films. It is getting more difficult. What sources exist? Who contributes to fill these sources? Does everybody contribute? So this is a bit, in a sloppy way, a description of what we will be looking into today with the help of two panels, and that follows a tradition. The first panel is made up of people who report of the observatory work of the past year around the topics of today. The second panel is then one which shall lead into an animated discussion with stakeholders of the very topic to how to finance, what are the perspectives, and will be moderated by André Lange, who will also then introduce those panelists, as I will now introduce, without losing much more time, the people of this panel. So we will actually have Julio Talavera Mila, film analyst of the Observatory, who will talk about the current trends in direct film funding, which is one of the pillars of how films can be financed. Then we have a second block where we look at the role of other people, other branches of the industry to help finance by contributing to the financing of film production funds or other ways of helping to contribute, and we do that from two perspectives along the organization of the observatory. So we have an introduction into legal issues. What does legislation do to oblige players to finance film production in Europe? This will be done by Maya Capello, head of department for legal information at the observatory, in a new phase to Cannes since July last year, but certainly not her last appearance at Cannes. And then on the right side, you'll have André Lange, who I believe most of you already know very well, who will speak about the economic weight of the mandatory financing. In this case, it's unfortunately the last appearance at Cannes, as, believe it or not, this man next to me is about to retire. So this is his last mission for the observatory and his last day of work, but will make him work really hard today. That's why he got to moderate the panel also. Then we have adopted another person for the observatory today, and this is, and it's a particular pleasure to welcome Jonathan Alsberg from Alsberg SBI, who has conducted for us last year a study on fiscal incentives, the third and important pillar, how production is being financed. So Jonathan will give you an insight as to what the findings of the study were. With this, we could almost start if we didn't have another tradition, which we of course will also follow this year. And this is leading me to introduce you to Martin Kanzler, also an analyst at the European Audiovisual Observatory. And he will do, as he does every year, give you a short rundown on the key developments in the European film markets. With this, I have almost said enough, except that I have to say the word hashtag, and this triggers a slide, and that should trigger for all of you who love to hashtag around to do so just by using the hashtag that you should have on the screen.
It's OBS-CAN 2015.
It is OBS CAN 2015. And then a very last remark, as you might have seen, or when coming, there were a lot of people coming to the conference. Not all, unfortunately, found a space because, well, we have as many seats as we have, and thereafter security doesn't allow anybody in anymore. But those who didn't come and those who might like to hear again what was discussed today will have a chance to do so via our internet site, where we will have a little video of today's event. Thank you. Martin, the floor is yours.
every year, I will very briefly highlight some of the key developments of the European cinema market last year, keeping in mind that all the figures are still considered to be provisional. In the EU, we registered a slight increase in admissions from 905 million up a little bit to 911. As you can see, when you look at the big picture 10-year development, this means that the admissions levels have kind of stabilized at a level slightly below the one we have seen before the temporary 3D hype started in 2009. And in fact, probably admissions would have declined if it had not been for a very strong performance in France. Finally, the end of an ongoing decline in Spain, and also exceptionally good results in Poland. As admissions continued to decline in actually almost 2/3 of the other EU markets, including the other three big markets, UK, Germany and Italy. Another thing we are observing is that GBO growth is back in line with the underlying admissions, both of them growing by 0.7%, 0.6% to 6.3 billion euro in the EU, meaning that the price hike, at least in euros, has stopped and we have a more proportional development. Growth in admissions was actually driven by European films. The admissions to European films increased by almost 30%, whereas admissions to US films declined, which results in the highest market share for European films that we have registered since we started tracking this figure, I think in 1996, meaning 33.6% of admissions went to European films, and that is excluding what we call Euro Inc. films, incoming investment films, financed by US studios like Harry Potter. And US market share went down from 69% to 63%. This is probably also linked to the fact that 2014 was another year where the big blockbusters failed to meet expectations. Here you see the revenues registered by the top grossing film in Europe, and you can clearly see that in the past 2 years, the top film, which in 2014 was Hobbit, Battle of the Five Armies, sold significantly less tickets than all the top performing films last year. And I did another fun exercise to see how franchise films developed. So I looked at all the franchise films which featured in the top 25 list in the EU, and it seems that the climax has been passed. Both the numbers and even more dramatically the admission figures to franchise films, at least in the top 25, have declined significantly in the past 2 years. Another trend we are seeing is an ever-growing number of film releases in the EU. Between the last 10 years, film releases increased from an estimated 1,300 to over 2,000 film releases in the EU, as production continues to grow to just above 1,600 European feature films produced in 2014, breaking down into 1,100 fiction and about 500 documentaries. And finally, to conclude, digitization is practically finalized with 92% of EU screens being digital. More information you will find in the Focus publication, which you can pick up on your way out. And with this rough overview, I would like to hand over to Julio to start the actual topic of the conference.
I think Martin tried to be very efficient. That's a good thing. So Julio, go ahead.
Just a second. Good morning.
So Julio has worked hard to get the figures ready to give you now an update on the current trends in film funding. So it's really trends, it's not the encompassing picture, which we of course would love to also supply and where we will work on this year to get you more figures towards the end of the year.
Good morning again. As you probably know, the European Audiovisual Observatory regularly publishes a report on public funding for film and audiovisual works in Europe. The last edition was released in 2011, and an update is foreseen for next year. It will include information on European as well as country-by-country figures on the funding population all around Europe and country by country, the income by type of source, meaning where the money comes from, the spend by activity, meaning where the money is spent, in which activities, meaning production, distribution, exhibition, etc., as well as an analysis of the trends over these last years. For the time being, without having comprehensive figures for each country and for each fund, what I would like to do with you today in these minutes is to analyze a series of concerns, of general assumptions within the industry that I have identified. The first one is that there is a concern that there are less public funds in Europe. The second one is that there is a concern that there is less funding available. And there is also a fear that we are witnessing a change of model, meaning that there is more and more fiscal incentives and less direct public funding. And the fourth one is that there is a diversification of public support, meaning that traditional activities such as film production are getting less money in order to fund other new schemes. But is it true? Well, I would like to present you some figures so that you can have your conclusions. The first one, the funding body population in Europe. As you can see, it is true that it grew from 2004 to 2009, but remains rather constant over the last 6 years. 262 funding bodies identified in 2009 and 254 in 2014. The distribution by geographical level, meaning national, community, regional and local funds, is quite similar to the one in 2009. Now, the fact that the total number of funds is pretty much the same as it was in 2009 doesn't mean that nothing happened in between. On the one hand, we identified that there are what we can call dormant funds, especially dormant regional funds. That is, funds which had a much higher budget in 2009 or before, and which now still exist. They appear in the picture, but the money they spend in the film industry is significantly lower. Then on the other hand, we have national trends. Just to give you a couple of examples, in the UK, the regional funds were restructured over this period, so there are less regional funds, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have disappeared. They have integrated in bigger institutions. And another example, in Poland, there was a growth of regional funds over the same period. Now, the concern that there is less money available. For the time being, I cannot offer you figures for all European countries. So what I have here is the evolution over the last 5 years in terms of support for film in general, at the top of the slide, and support of film production at the bottom of the slide. As you can see, the trend is quite constant. The only exception would be the support for film production in France, which declined over this 5-year period. Now, the change of model, the concern that there are more and more fiscal incentives and less money coming through public national funds. If it's true, and if we do an analysis country by country, this is the kind of graph we would find. So fiscal incentives going up and national funds going down. Let's see country by country if that was the case for the very few countries for which we have the information. In France, such a pattern is not to be found here. In fact, you can see that from 2010 to 2011, fiscal incentives and national funds decreased almost in parallel. Same thing happened in Germany. fiscal incentives remained constant over this 5-year period, and over that period national funds went up and down, so that pattern is not to be found here. However, in Italy, if we go back to 2009, we can identify the pattern of our hypothesis here for the evolution of public support to film, and also down in terms of support to film production. And last, the figures, the evolution the evolution in the United Kingdom, same thing. Here we cannot find the pattern presented in our hypothesis. So it's true that this has happened in some countries, but it's not necessarily true that this is an overall trend. Now the question of diversification, the fear that there is less money going to film production, and this is done in order to fund new schemes such as TV production or the support of new technologies, video game production, etc., etc. When preparing this part of my presentation, I was not able to find any indicator that proves that this is the case. And I think that's already a good indicator. So I borrowed from the evolution of fiscal incentives in France these figures that show that the introduction of a new fiscal incentive, they are marked with arrows in the year they were introduced, did not represent a decrease of the allocation for the already existing incentives. And in some cases it was quite the contrary. The introduction of a new incentive was followed by an important increase of the already existing incentives. So we cannot say that this is an action-reaction mechanism. Now, in conclusion, by doing the kind of analysis I did today, we will have a good picture of the public investment trends from the outside. But it's also important to analyze the inside. That is, if the amount allocated to each fund, if the amount spent by each fund were more or less the same, in any case, we could be witnessing a change of model. How? Because the funds have decided to target different producers or different productions, because the conditions to access the available funding is different, and that would represent a change in the average and median budget of the productions, and also an increase or decrease of international co-productions. So that would be a much more analysis of the internal situation which is within each country. But that, I'm afraid, is something for which you will have to wait until we release our next report in 2016. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer after the conference, or you can always contact me at my email address. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julio. Now, you have heard in the first go how it looks with the funds, what the trends are there, and it all makes it look like they're there all natural. But they are not there all natural, as we know. Somebody has to not only establish them, but then, and that's the crucial part, has to feed them. Where does the money come from? Who all has to contribute? That's now the next issue at which we will look first of all from a legal perspective, and that is what Maya will explain to you now. Maya?
Thank you. Thank you, Sanne. I will try to deal with my 10-minute slots in order to show you two things. First part, the money, and then who pays, which is always very interesting, and how the two different sectors, cinema and broadcasting, are somehow interacting. And then Andre will follow up with the figures, so we will try to interact in the best way possible. So what we are seeing today, and Julio dealt already with the first part, direct funding, Jonathan will follow with the fiscal incentives. I will focus on bullet number 3, so the legal obligations on the main stakeholders that we have on the broadcasting side in an expanded sense, so broadcasters, distributors, and on-demand service providers. What is happening here? There is a different approach, of course, when you talk about legal obligations, because we are talking here about the regulatory environment, which does allow me to skip all the state aid issues. So this is something I will not talk about. What I will concentrate on is what these legal obligations consist of. They can be mainly of two types. You can have stakeholders contributing directly to the production of works or to the acquisition of rights, or they can themselves contribute to the direct funding by contributing to the funds themselves. And these two I will show from the national point of view, bearing in mind that we have also a European regulatory framework that gives us some guidance. The Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which is familiar and certain to all of you, distinguished still between two traditional types of stakeholders, the linear services, that is TV broadcasting, and the non-linear services, that is on-demand services. And this is very, very briefly what these obligations consist of. And there are mainly of two types. You have transmission quotas and you have investment obligations. In the on-demand world, the situation is a little bit more scattered. You have also another type of way of contributing from the broadcaster side, which is the prominence to the European works in the catalogue. So basically, the traditional world of broadcasters, they have two types of obligations. They have to ensure that the majority of the transmission time covers European works, and films may be part of that, but the European legislation does not go into it, and this is important to underline because here you have big room for the national differentiation. And they have also ensured some money to the independent programming of European works, including recent works of the last 5 years. The on-demand providers, they have a more flexible framework, and the different member states have interpreted these articles in a quite different way. I will dig into 5 examples to show you how the different combinations can be. The harmonization at EU level does not oblige the member states to act in the same way. So we will see that the choices that are made at national level vary quite a lot. In Spain and Italy, we have investment obligations, and here I'm talking only about money, so I have left out the quota obligation for the programming. In Germany, we have obligations as to contributing to a fund. In Belgium, they have opted, and I'm talking about the French community, to an alternative. There is an option for the broadcasters between investment or contributing. And the French, they have opted for the full pot, so they have obliged both things, so both to invest and to contribute to a fund. I will go very briefly through each of them and, of course, be available to answer further questions. When it comes to Spain, what was very interesting is that this is also fruit of some case law. In the beginning, these rules, and in the beginning I mean before 2010, the broadcasters, they got a rule where they had to invest specifically in film, and the broadcasters were not very happy. So this was declared unconstitutional because there was a potential conflict between the two sectors. Why should broadcasters only feed the film industry and not themselves? And indeed the rules were changed. So what you see here briefly, I will exempt you from the details, is that there is an obligation to invest a certain percentage of the income earned by the operators in different types of works. They include cinema, films, series, documentaries, animated series. So here you have an integration between cinema and European works in the audiovisual sector. And this was the condition in order to ensure that these rules were compliant to the Spanish general system. From the European point of view, there were no problems flagged out by the Court of Justice. Another country opting for investment obligation is Italy. There is a distinction here again between the linear world and the non-linear world, so a bit chit-chatting the European framework. What is new and what is still being discussed is a sort of incentive system in order to make sure that broadcasters find it interesting to also promote the works they are investing in. So it's not sufficient to put money in the works if they are not shown, if the catalog don't give visibility to them. So then what is being discussed now in Italy with the stakeholders is to ensure a sort of incentive as to the reduction of the quota by introducing an option for the prominence tools. And this combination has also proved to be very fruitful. In the next country I will just briefly mention, which is the French community of Belgium, where the prominence has shown to be a very interesting tool in combination with a double option system, investment or contributions. So the broadcasters, they can opt for one or another solution, and there is of course a differentiation according to the size of these operators. So of course the bigger it is, then the more money you should give into the fund or into the purchase of programs or into the investment of acquisition rights. In Belgium you have an alternative with investment and contribution. If you go back to Germany, there is an obligation only to contribute to a fund, which is the Filmförderungsanstalt. And what was interesting also to highlight here, that also in Germany we have case law that had to intervene because of some unfairness. In the beginning, and here again we have 2010 as a landmark year, there was a freedom for the broadcasters to negotiate freely how much to invest. The Federal Administrative Court then intervened and pointed out that this was not exactly what should be considered as fair. So the law laid down the criteria according to which these contributions had to be made. And you see there is a quite detailed outline as to how much percentage of the expenses have to be devoted to what type of investment from which type of broadcasters. Here you have a vast involvement also from the cinema sector. So this is an example of a fund where both broadcasters and the sector of the cinema is contributing. And what is also worth to highlight is that it's still pending from the Commission a decision on a tax, on an extension of a national legislation provision also to foreign providers. And this is something that is also happening in France. So you'll see that the national approaches are looking also a little bit beyond the national borders. Since I mentioned France, you will get here into the heaviest example, so both investment and contribution obligations, they are all fine from the European point of view. And what you see here is that you have an inclusion of many different types of on-demand providers. This means that the online world is more and more concerned by these types of obligations. Catch-up services are also included. Here the distinction is made according to how many feature films they have indeed in their catalog, in order to ensure that not all broadcasters or on-demand providers are subject to these rules in case they were not interested in having film in their catalogs, which is of course from an editorial point of view something important. So to wrap up, we have a quite complex scene. We have two types of obligations that are crossing each other in different patterns. There is no harmonization as to this type of choices. So we have both investments in production directly from the broadcasters or in purchase of the rights from the producers in the cinema sector. Or we can have also direct contributions to the cinema fund. Many countries have introduced specific quotas for cinematographic productions, which is also something that does not come directly from the European legislation, but is nationally determined. And as a general trend, what is possible to notice is that there is an expansion, a gradual expansion also to the new services. So whereas the directive is, of course, it's from 2007, so this is also quite easy to understand, still sticks to the more traditional services, including the on-demand service consumption. On the national level, there are some initiatives in order to capture the online world and also what happens outside the national borders. Public service broadcasters usually have stronger burdens. This is also quite easy to understand since they also benefit from public funding. And there are, of course, exceptions in order to ensure that these obligations don't weigh too much for the smaller operators. So very often you see there are minimum thresholds, which is based either on the yearly turnover or on the amount of products that you have in the catalog, and some services are to a certain extent excluded. So this is to give you really just an overview of how big the variety is at the national level, and I'm sure now that André will be able to show you how this is reflecting also from the economic point of view with different figures from the various countries. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Maya. So now you have already followed quite a way on this path from talking about funds to talking really about funding these funds or directly funding films. You've seen that there's an issue more as to the contribution not only of the linear world but also on the online world as to who has to contribute. You've seen there are legal issues, very sensitive legal issues that are European dimension, and that the solutions have a real variety. Now, what we haven't seen yet is how this translates really in economic importance, and that's what André will now walk you through.
Thank you, Suzanne, and good morning. To have a bit of cultural diversity in this room, I think I will speak in my favorite language, which is French. So for people who need to do as a home, but this needs to be better. Donc, comme Maya, je vais me concentrer sur les obligations de contribution par les différents types d'acteurs et donc sur les contributions obligatoires aux financeurs qui sont non seulement les diffuseurs et les opérateurs de services à la demande, mais aussi dans certains pays, comme on va le voir, les plateformes de distribution, les opérateurs de pay TV et, ce qui est finalement la forme la plus ancienne de contribution obligatoire, les contributions des exploitants. Je ne vais pas m'étendre beaucoup sur les contributions des diffuseurs, c'est ce qu'il y a de plus connu, ça prend des formes différentes suivant les pays. Mais les pays où il y a essentiellement des contributions obligatoires en investissement, c'est la Belgique, l'Espagne, la France, la Grèce et l'Italie. Et le mieux documenté, c'est certainement la situation en France. Je vous renvoie, vous pouvez le trouver facilement à Cannes ou sur Internet, le bilan annuel du CNC, qui donne énormément d'informations, vraiment diffuseur par diffuseur, sur les investissements directs dans la production. Vous voyez que ça a chuté assez fort depuis 2012, puisqu'on avait en 2010 plus de 350 millions d'euros investis, et on est tombé maintenant à un petit peu moins de 300 millions d'investissements, mais c'est quand même des montants considérables. L'autre pays pour lequel on a des données très détaillées, un petit peu plus difficiles à trouver, mais elles sont publiées avec plus de retard aussi par le régulateur espagnol, où en Espagne, non seulement les diffuseurs publics et privés sont obligés d'investir dans la production, mais également les éditeurs de chaînes à péage et les distributeurs, et donc depuis 2010, les câbles opérateurs. Et c'est d'ailleurs une des raisons pour lesquelles nous avons introduit dans ce débat, dans le panel tout à l'heure, une représentante de l'industrie du câble, car ça me paraît un des éléments importants et relativement nouveaux dans certains pays, c'est le rôle des câbles distributeurs. En Italie, le reporting par l'instance de régulation est déjà nettement moins évident. Les données les plus récentes que j'ai trouvées sont celles concernant l'année 2012, publiées par l'AGCOM, par l'autorité de régulation. Et il n'y a pas de montant financier indiqué, il y a juste des pourcentages de contribution par rapport au chiffre d'affaires des groupes de diffusion. et donc on n'a pas avec précision les montants investis. En ce qui concerne les obligations d'investissement par les opérateurs de services VOD en France, là aussi on a relativement peu d'informations. En fait, l'instance de régulation, le CSA, a publié il y a un peu plus d'un an le premier rapport qui concernait l'année 2011. Et là on peut voir que l'ensemble film plus œuvre audiovisuelle, ça représentait un total de 16 millions d'euros investis. Pour le cinéma, on n'a pas le montant exact, mais ça devait être aux alentours de 10 millions d'euros investis, et il n'y a que 3 opérateurs dont le chiffre d'affaires était suffisant pour être soumis à l'obligation d'investissement. Pour 2012, le CSA a également publié très récemment son rapport, mais il n'y a pas de chiffre. Il est simplement indiqué que tous les opérateurs ont rempli leurs obligations. C'est un petit peu dommage de voir que la transparence diminue dans un pays qui pourtant a des traditions de reporting très, très importantes. Alors, en ce qui concerne les obligations de contribution au fonds, les situations sont extrêmement diversifiées. Je vais essayer de schématiser ici sur un tableau ce qu'on a pu repérer dans un rapport que la Commission européenne vient de publier, que vous pouvez trouver sur le site de la Commission européenne. Vous voyez qu'il y a plusieurs pays où les exploitants sont obligés de contribuer, plusieurs pays où les diffuseurs publics ou privés sont obligés de contribuer. Les distributeurs de services, c'est déjà moins fréquent. On trouve ça en Allemagne, en France, en Croatie, en Pologne. Nous allons le voir tout à l'heure. Les distributeurs vidéo se trouvent dans quelques pays, et les fournisseurs de services VOD dans un nombre aussi limité de pays. Et il n'y a aucun pays où les plateformes ouvertes de distribution de programmes, donc les plateformes de type YouTube ou Dailymotion, sont obligées de contribuer, ce qui suscite débat dans certains pays. Par exemple en Italie, les diffuseurs privés se plaignent du fait que YouTube est leur concurrent sur le marché publicitaire et n'est pas soumis aux mêmes obligations d'investissement. Alors en France, les obligations principales concernent les diffuseurs et les distributeurs, et malheureusement le CNC ne publie pas la ventilation entre quelles sont les contributions des diffuseurs et les contributions des distributeurs. Ça aurait été intéressant de le savoir. De même, on n'a pas la ventilation dans des contributions des distributeurs de vidéos physiques et des fournisseurs de services VOD. En Allemagne, on dispose des données sur les contributions des exploitants des distributeurs vidéo, mais là aussi sans ventilation entre opérateurs VOD et distributeurs de vidéos physiques, et les données des diffuseurs privés. Et vous voyez que c'est relativement stable, mais je ne l'ai pas indiqué ici, mais certains montants sont indiqués dans les rapports de la FFA sous réserve parce qu'il y a des contestations juridiques de la part de certains acteurs. Alors, ce qui m'a le plus intéressé finalement, c'est de découvrir les chiffres de la Pologne, parce que là, on voit que si on additionne les contributions des câbles opérateurs et des opérateurs de plateformes satellitaires de diffusion à péage, cela représente plus de 50% du financement de l'Institut du film polonais, auquel il faut ajouter 37% qui viennent de la part des diffuseurs. Et quand la loi a été adoptée il y a une dizaine d'années, il y a eu des débats très forts. Les câbles opérateurs polonais s'étaient fortement opposés à cette obligation, mais on aura l'occasion d'en discuter tout à l'heure avec Jacek Fuchkiewicz. Alors, un cas intéressant est celui de la communauté française de Belgique. Maya a mentionné que les acteurs, en particulier les câblodistributeurs, ont le choix entre investissement direct ou contribution au fonds. Et jusqu'à présent, jusqu'à l'an dernier, essentiellement, ils avaient choisi la contribution au fonds. Mais fin d'année dernière, les principaux câbles opérateurs ont annoncé que dorénavant, ils allaient investir directement en utilisant le système de tax shelter. Et du coup, la commission de sélection des films se trouve avec un budget réduit de 2 millions d'euros, ce qui est assez important pour un petit pays ou un petit territoire comme la communauté française de Belgique. Un des problèmes, et je crois que c'est un problème délicat et le plus important auquel est confrontée actuellement la politique européenne, c'est celui de la délocalisation des services, délocalisation des diffuseurs, dans certains cas délocalisation des plateformes de distribution et surtout délocalisation des services audiovisuels à la demande qui s'établissent en général dans des pays où il n'y a pas d'obligation d'investissement et cela suscite évidemment des contestations de la part des opérateurs nationaux qui demandent à leur gouvernement pourquoi sommes-nous obligés de contribuer alors que nos concurrents étrangers ne sont pas obligés de le faire. Et on a pu calculer que 60% des services VOD en Europe étaient établis en dehors du pays qu'ils visaient. Donc c'est un problème vraiment structurel en Europe. Alors ce problème est confronté maintenant, se discute au niveau politique, puisque l'Allemagne, dans sa révision de sa loi sur le cinéma l'an dernier, a introduit une obligation de contribution pour les services VOD étrangers dès lors qu'ils n'étaient pas obligés d'investir dans leur pays d'origine. C'est un cas qui est soumis à l'examen de la Commission européenne et on attend la décision de la Commission européenne sur la conformité de ce type de dispositif avec la loi européenne et en particulier avec l'article 13 de la directive sur les services de médias audiovisuels. Et la France, elle, dans sa loi fiscale révisée de fin 2014, a également introduit une obligation de contribution pour les services VOD établis à l'étranger qui ciblaient le territoire français. Mais là aussi, il faudra passer par une procédure de vérification avec la Commission européenne. Voilà, donc il y a là un sujet important à discuter. Je ne sais pas si c'est vraiment le thème du débat aujourd'hui, parce que la révision de la directive n'est pas encore vraiment à l'agenda des institutions européennes, mais ça va venir dans quelques mois. Vous trouverez plus de détails sur tout cela dans le rapport que nous avons publié, que nous avons rédigé pour la Commission européenne, donc qui est disponible sur le site de la Commission européenne et bien entendu dans notre annuaire statistique. Merci.
Merci, André, for having underlined the importance of the economic side of those obligations, but also for having underlined it always, I think, is a side theme, and it's actually also, by the way, one of our main themes at the observatory, and that is that there is an issue of transparency, that we would actually need to have more information in order to have a clearer and a better picture on the market, and that this is maybe particularly so for the on-demand world. So maybe next year we can come back and already report a bit of success, we'll see. But again, it's not all about money, it's also all about knowing what money flows from where to where. We try our best to make this more visible. Now, we're still not at the end of those presentations of the first panel, because there is an equally important set of schemes that allow to finance films and that go from the system in a different way, and that we therefore had the pleasure to have Jonathan explore for us. And Jonathan, please, it's now your turn to explain to the audience what the main finding of fiscal incentive schemes are.
Okay, good morning everybody. Thank you very much, Suzanne. Thank you for the invitation to come here. As you said earlier, I'm not, my company, Osberg SBI, is not part of the observatory. We're an independent strategy advisor, but we are hired to produce a report, which I have a hard copy of here, and I'm going to summarize in this presentation, analyzing the impact of fiscal incentive schemes around Europe. The report is available for purchase on the Audiovisual Observatory's website, and on our website there's a link to this report, and there's also some other reports that we've written in similar topics that are available for you. But my presentation is going to have less data, and there's lots of data in the actual report, but it's more about, if you like, an interpretation of the data. In the work that we did, which took about 10 months, we analysed lots and lots of data, but we also spoke to nearly 100 professionals around Europe on these schemes that were operating to get their opinions, and based on other work we've done over the years, I'm going to present to you now what our findings were. But just to recap, so fiscal incentives have been commonly used on an increasing basis to stimulate more production in Europe and indeed in many countries around the world. And this has been quite a phenomenon, as you all know, but there's never previously been, until the Observatory decided to do one, analysis of their impacts on a European level. So we were commissioned to do this study. Just a quick reference to the title, fiscal incentives. We very deliberately avoid referring to this group of initiatives as tax incentives, because these days most of them are nothing to do with tax whatsoever. Although, you know, I sometimes slip into the error, and other people talk about tax incentives around Europe, most of the ones we observe or analyse are nothing to do with tax, and I'll explain how that is the case. In our report, we were sort of asked to look at three areas, really. One is the landscape, describing what's going on around Europe in this area. Secondly, to look at the trends that we've observed so far, and indeed anticipate the trends that we think might come in the future. And thirdly, try and identify as best as we can the impact that these incentives have in the countries in which they're operating. And that's an impact on a number of different metrics, as you can see there, not only in terms of the economic or perhaps cultural impact in the countries concerned, but also on neighbouring or adjacent countries. Finally, in our report, we came up with some recommendations about how this sort of analysis might be done in the future. In doing our work, one of the various ways we decided to measure things was to do what we call a difference in differences approach. And so we identified a number of countries that had incentives and had had them for either a period of time or had introduced them in the period that we did our analysis, which is basically the last 6 years. And we compared what was going on in countries with what was happening in countries that didn't have incentive. It was just one way to measure what's going on. We selected the countries to measure on the basis simply that they had enough deep data, they could provide us with a lot of information about their schemes, and that data was comparable country to country. I want to thank all of the countries that helped us in this. We could not have done our job without it. And also the countries that weren't studied in detail were also very helpful in providing us with information. Okay, so let's look at the landscape. And just to say a word here that is probably already obvious to you, we're only looking at automatic production-related fiscal incentives. We didn't analyse direct or selective funding per se, although in our interviews we did talk to people about these other schemes so that we could do our best in stripping out the impact of the automatic fiscal incentive from the direct incentive. Okay, we have identified three categories of fiscal incentives around Europe and indeed around the world. The first is what essentially first started off this pattern, which was tax shelters. So 25 years ago, countries like Ireland and Luxembourg and others, and France indeed, established schemes which relied on investment from high tax-paying individuals or companies that was channeled into film production. And they were able to deduct their investments against tax liabilities. Secondly is the more, I think, popular schemes, which we call cash rebates, which are based not on any investment structure like a tax shelter. And of course, a tax shelter, there is an ownership of profits or copyright, which the other schemes don't have. This is merely based on the amount of production expenditure and repaying a percentage of their qualifying costs. Tax credits are very similar. Annoyingly, the word tax appears here to confuse us all. But basically, these are cash rebates, but they are applied for and they're received by the production company when they submit their annual tax return. And this is mostly because governments don't want to be providing rebates with one hand while they're still waiting to be paid tax owed to them on the other by the companies concerned. And as at the end of last year, around Europe there are 11 tax credit schemes, 9 rebate schemes, and 6 remaining tax shelter. France was the most active and has the deepest experience with schemes of all these types. The UK has 4, Italy 3, and most of the other countries 1 each. In many cases, these schemes support industries in addition to film production, high-end TV drama, animation, video, etc. But our analysis was mostly to do with what's happening in the feature film area, because that's where we found the schemes had been around longest, and there was the deepest data and the most comparable data. So what are the trends? Well, as we all know, a broad range of countries are introducing incentives, and indeed there are several countries that don't have them that are seriously considering them as we speak. And in our view, that reflects a desire to both build up local production activity and also attract international portable productions, and most importantly, possibly, be able to participate more in European co-productions. These incentives can deliver against all of those 3 aims. These days, in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, most of the new schemes that we've seen introduced rebate style. 6 of the 7 in the 5 years we looked at took this form. And indeed, many existing schemes that might be tax shelters, for example, are being updated and in the case, for example, of Ireland, moved over towards a rebate sort of structure. And one of the reasons this is going on, in our view, from this work and other work that we've done, is that governments around Europe and indeed around the world are increasingly recognizing the broad range of economic as well as cultural benefits of a thriving, healthy film, TV, and indeed video games increasing sector. So this is the background. This is why we think that the main reason that these incentives are in place. And you know, when you're measuring these benefits, there are the standard measurements we all know. And indeed, we reviewed lots of reports in individual countries about the impacts, but also things like increasing tourism, soft power, etc. And finally, on the benefits side, there's an increasing recognition in many countries that the creative industries as a whole are very desirable and positive economic growth areas. And furthermore, that film and high-end TV production drives lots of activity across these other creative industries more than any other single creative industry does. So if you want a healthy creative industry, you need a healthy film and TV production sector, because that drives activity. Okay, in terms of particular findings, what happens when a country introduces an incentive? Well, the first thing that happens is an immediate push towards filling whatever surplus capacity for production there exists in a country. So this is increased productivity and immediately fills up in terms of the capacity available. But if a country introducing an incentive does not also plan to expand capacity in terms of facilities or crew, then there's a great danger that very quickly this full capacity, as you might imagine, leads to cost inflation. So that's a warning that I'll possibly come back to later. For countries with incentives, over time we've measured that their film and TV sectors, regardless of the actual size of the sector, delivers a greater proportion of GDP in that country than those countries that don't have an incentive. So they sort of punch above their weight, if in the vernacular. And also, the growth of those sectors tend to outperform those without, in general. The other thing that we measure clearly when we're looking at any kind of impact of a scheme is employment growth, and countries where there have been incentives for quite a long time, such as France, for example, very impressive employment growth statistics from the CNC as a result of the introduction of different types of incentives that they've had. And also, which is very interesting, adjacent countries that both have incentives, the workforce in each country tends to be quite mobile and is able to move across national boundaries or regional boundaries very simply and quickly. And this has helped, for example, in the Czech Republic and Hungary, which over the years both introduced incentives. And film workers and indeed facilities providers or suppliers have been able to work across in both countries. And so that contributes to a kind of a broader regional development and an increase in co-production activity. And also it helps in terms of a very important need in our industry, which is the development of greater skills. Moving on, we tried to identify the degree to which this increase in production activity was flowing into Europe from outside, or was it moving from Europe, from within Europe to outside Europe, or within countries in Europe. And sadly, the data that most countries collect doesn't enable us to do a deep analysis on a comparable basis. But what we did do was, in our consultations, we tended or we always address this particular issue. And it would appear that in Europe as a whole, most of the bulk of the additional activity is coming from outside Europe. Now that might be a function of the success of France and the UK and more recently Italy to attract these projects, and may not apply to every country. But as we know, the movement of content or the decision of a producer to base in a country or another is not only just about incentives. There are creative imperatives that demand, that create demands for where it's going to shoot, and other co-production reasons as well. It's not just about chasing incentives. In fact, we didn't see much evidence of chasing incentives. But when one country introduces a new incentive, it definitely leads initially to a loss of business in an adjacent country that does not have an incentive. This happened in Czech Republic when Hungary introduced an incentive. What happened was the Czechs introduced theirs, and then both countries now seem to grow at the same time. However, there are big problems if a non-incentive country has a very high cost base and is adjacent to an incentive country with a low cost base. For example, in most of Scandinavia and the Baltic states, or Sweden, Latvia, for example, or Norway, Iceland, where the latter do have incentives, that really does become a problem. Very important point here to make. Where new incentives are being talked about, we've noticed in the past producers fearful that an introduction of a new incentive will be accompanied by a reduction in direct or selective funding at the same time. That money will be taken from one pot for this new pot. Actually, there's almost no evidence that this is the case. We've seen, for example, in Italy, where we did notice this change, we are told that actually what the sequence of events was in Italy, there was serious government cuts across the board, and that reduced the selective funding, but at the same time they introduced new incentive schemes of this type to compensate for that, so it's worked in our favour. And look, thinking about Julio's slides earlier, where you noticed the change in the volume of the UK, for example, and the incentive funding against the direct funding, one thing to bear in mind is the incentive funding is an effect of demand, not for money, and not really about how much money we've got to supply. And in fact, this leads me to another very subtle point that actually we didn't really quite realize until we did this study, is that the new cash rebate style incentives tend to be self-financing. They don't take money away from anywhere as long as there's sufficient additional production activity. And that's because the additional production activity generates sufficient new tax revenues from the production itself, from employment taxes, from social taxes, from company taxes, that these additional amounts that would not have been there before are more than enough to pay for the incentive when the incentive is eventually paid out, and that happens months later. So that's something to bear in mind. But they also have induced producers to spread their business activities to other areas, and it's produced, when an incentive is around and it's been around for a while, an increased level of confidence in the sector, so that investors are more interested in putting money into infrastructure projects like studios, which we saw in Hungary, etc. And indeed, from a government point of view, the data in our report show that, quite often, the introduction of an incentive gives a very, very strong multiplier. So, for example, in the UK, where we've done a report recently, every pound of the incentive that's paid out has already resulted in £3.75 of additional tax coming in, and that same. As to our recommendations, if this sort of study is being done in the future, we recommend that there's a coordinated effort across Europe to collect the same kind of data in sufficient depth that makes it comparable. And there are some serious differences in the way production is accounted for example. In some countries, when a production starts shooting, all of the production cost of that film is counted in the year in which it starts, and so this can result in situations where film starts in November or December and continue to spend most of their money the next year. Actually, all of the money is counted in the first year, which produces spikes that can be quite, that can mask the real growth of a sector. Also, it's quite hard to figure out what the evidence is before an incentive is introduced and afterwards, because they're not always collecting comparable data. And so in our report we do have lots of recommendations about how to do this in the future, which would make policy decisions much more straightforward. And indeed, the Observatory is very much leading in this kind of transparency. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That rounds up our first part of this event. You will see now flying changes, where I would ask the panelists to come up and we'll just move. You please stay. You have been great in paying so much attention. You outdid lots of lectures that I have attended and lots of other events, so keep on doing the good job. You'll get your slot for questions in a little while. And while this change is happening, let me also tell you that you can visit us at our booth in Cannes and also get the publication there, for example. It's on level 01, number 1802 in the Palais.
You have to rush.
Avant de présenter les panélistes, je voudrais vous inviter à considérer la contribution de Joan Miró sur l'évolution des financements du cinéma en Europe. Ça se termine par une sorte d'explosion rouge et je crois que c'est de cela que nous allons débattre aujourd'hui. Alors, pour débattre de cette question de l'avenir du financement du cinéma en Europe, nous avons avec nous 5 panélistes que je vais présenter dans l'ordre de gauche à ma droite. Andrea Occhibenti, qui est un producteur italien, qui est le fondateur de Lucky Red, une des principales entreprises de production et de distribution en Italie, et il va nous l'expliquer, aussi impliqué dans des contributions, dans des coproductions européennes, dont certaines d'ailleurs obtiennent de temps en temps des palmes d'or. Jacek Sukiewicz est conseiller du directeur de l'Institut polonais du film. Il est aussi un des membres actifs de l'EFA, de l'organisation qui regroupe les directeurs des agences nationales du cinéma, et c'est aussi un historien du cinéma polonais. Et il nous expliquera la situation en Pologne. Lucia Riccarde est la chef d'unité du programme média qui fait maintenant partie du programme Europe créative de l'Union européenne. Caroline Van Wade est la directrice générale de Cable Europe, qui est la fédération qui regroupe les principaux câbles opérateurs en Europe. Et je voudrais vraiment la remercier parce que je crois que c'est la première fois que votre organisation vient au Festival de Cannes. C'est le monde du câble est quand même, apparemment, mais c'est une des choses dont on va discuter loin du secteur du cinéma, mais non, ils font partie du secteur et je pense que c'est très bien qu'ils soient là. Et Mike Downey est un producteur britannique, mais actif au niveau européen et même international, et il est aussi le vice-président de l'European Film Academy. Bien, alors je propose que nous commencions d'abord par donner la parole aux deux producteurs, and I will now switch to English. We have two producers with, of course, a strong national implementation, but also with European or international activities. And so I think they are in a good position to compare a bit from the practical side how the different film policy impact their work. So, maybe Mike, if you could start to give your point of view, what do you prefer? Do you prefer direct funding? Do you prefer broadcaster investment? Or do you prefer to use the fiscal incentives?
I think it's a very interesting question, and I'll kind of take them in a different kind of order, if you don't mind. Good morning, hello. Very nice to be here. Very nice to be here with a newcomer to Cannes as well. Thank you. I'm very glad to be speaking this morning as one of the producers working in the UK, committed to world cinema, committed to making European films, and committing to trying to use British tools of film funding, which is reputed to be notoriously inward-looking, traditionally looking across the ocean to the west, and not towards the landmass in the east, let's say, and to a great extent protectionist of a certain Anglo-centric way of producing films, rather than looking to the European collective of filmmaking. That having been said, I've always had this urge as an islander that I should put my cards on the table right away and reiterate that as an Irish-born London resident with a Croatian partner who was educated in France and who speaks European languages, I feel that along with many Britons, very, very much a part of the European ideal. And so that may inform our discussion. That having been said, I'm feeling a little bit like Andre today. I think it also could be my swan song. It could be my last panel here, with the referendum coming up in the UK, possibly sooner rather than later. So it's been a pleasure, Andre. That having been said, we may just simply replace the UK with Scotland. So I think it's a sort of a win-win situation. Nevertheless, I believe very much that Britain can play a greater role in European co-production in many areas. I'm convinced, for example, by the by, that, I'm just sitting next to Robert here, I was convinced that, by the by, if Euroimage would accept a British presence, the UK would do well to join its European brothers and sisters in that idea. And believe me, the British producing community thinks the same way as well. Now, to come back to Andre, let me think. I mean, the criticism I hear all too often about co-producing with the UK, for example, is just too difficult. It's just too complicated. It's just too much trouble. Well, to be honest, there are times when I would agree with that sentiment. However, it's not always the case. And to bear this out, for example, my company, Film and Music Entertainment, the company that I share with my partner Sam Taylor and chairman director Stephen Daldry, that was originally part of a Frankfurt DAX IPO. 15 years later, it's made 50 European co-productions, a dozen of which were Euroimage awarded, on a total budget of 275 million, involving over 40 countries. And it does bear witness to the fact that it is possible to engage successfully with the UK and vice versa, and to take mutual advantage of the varied film support systems that are on offer. And there are a number on offer. I know that many of you are familiar with our tripartite system of gate-kept, direct and indirect funding, but for the sake of those who are less familiar, I'll just make a few observations on those. According to a report by our esteemed colleagues at the European Audiovisual Observatory, which is fantastically done, the total number of UK film productions, including inward investment films, fell from 323 to 223 films, starting principal photography in 2014. That's a drop of 33%. Production spend, on the other hand, increased. this was more or less exclusively driven by the 20 US studio-owned British films, like The Fast and the Furious 6. They accounted for over 75% of the total production spend in the country, which is excellent news for crew, it's excellent news for the four-wall studios, it's excellent news for the US majors. But it's slightly less good news for domestic producers and production companies. Why? Well, of course, with all these productions, there is zero British or European ownership and zero British or European profits for independent producers. For the salaried crew, it's great. For the shareholders of publicly listed companies, it's great. But for independent entrepreneurs who want to make British and European films, it isn't. I think just in passing as well, another statistic that's worth noting, in 2013, 37 co-productions were made in the UK. There were 45 in 2012, and the spend of £54 million was down from 75 million in 2012. I think the general scene with regard to the UK and European co-production is fairly well known in terms of British filmmakers, British production companies, and I won't go into that in too much detail. The largest government body to provide funds to the UK film industry is Jonathan the Taxman, although they're not necessarily tax funds themselves. Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs provided 214 million towards UK films, which is 55% of the total amount invested in the UK film industry back in 2012. The BFI provided 87 million via lottery funding, and the aforementioned two public broadcasters were the next biggest investors. Film 4 and had 15 million, and the BBC had 12 million. And then in the regions, of course, we have the national film agencies, Creative England, Creative Scotland, Film Cymru Wales, Northern Ireland Screen, who offer funding development opportunities. Now, as of the 1st of April 2013, the British Film Institute has committed up to £1 million per annum for international co-production. That's the same amount that the BFI spent on short films in 2012. To encourage creative excellence in co-production, where the majority of the creative input comes from one of the UK's partner countries, that's the kind of thing that they're doing. Project priority for the fund is given to world-class non-British filmmakers who wish to engage with UK talent, UK involvement enhancing the international appeal of an exceptional project that's originated outside the UK, that kind of thing. Not just for European productions, but for the swathes of co-production possibilities offered by treaties with such large filmmaking countries as India, Brazil, China, Australia, New Zealand. So given the 1,600 films, I know I was always working on 1,500, given the 1,600 films that we are now fabulously making in Europe, you don't really need me to help you with the arithmetic as to the impact of that kind of funding. Other direct funding that's in the UK is provided by film tax relief to benefit British films that are made by the company. We've talked enough about those, I think. Indirect assistance is provided by the UK government scheme, amongst others in the form of the Enterprise Investment Scheme or the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme, and these are tax investments which are provided to UK taxpayers to encourage them to invest in production. So, we got there in the end. This is a roundabout way of saying that the UK is open for business with Europe. The systems are skewed in favour of US companies and big budget studio shoots. Statistically, there will be a minimal possibility of any support coming from the gate-kept funds. That having been said, Channel 4 have The Lobster here in competition, and Channel 4 also have the Youth, don't they? Yes, exactly. So, with judicious use of equity funding, I think, that equity funding, which is largely script, sales figures and talent driven, in addition to sort of automatic available funding that's there, with a regional bolt-on from the West Midlands, from Northern Ireland or Scotland, I think it is possible for independent producers and entrepreneurs to function, for European colleagues to bring us their projects for co-production, and for us not to be reliant let's say, on the specific and in many cases fairly predictable tastes of the funders of the gate-kept funds. Thank you.
Thank you. We have some question for you, but later.
I knew there'd be extra torture.
Now, let's go now to south of Europe, to Italy. Andrea, well, I forget to say that Andrea who still is an actor, and
No more.
and he has played Fabrice Del Dongo in La Chartreuse de Parme. So do you feel still like Fabrice in Waterloo, in the battlefield, not understanding what is around you?
I hope not. Let me give a picture of the situation in Italy, an update of what is the situation. We have seen some slides where we see that the direct funding has decreased, and also it's been fragmented, meaning that the film have had less than before. So there has been less money to more projects. So this has also had an effect on the average cost of the films. Also, the broadcasters have decreased their investment in films. We have mainly two broadcasters that contribute to the production. One is the public one, RAI, and the other one is Mediaset. The peculiarity is that both have distribution company, and both mainly have controlled the majority of Italian films produced and distributed. As you have seen, we have a very high market share, national market share. It's 29%. It's only second to France. But the peculiarity of Italy is that market share is mostly Italian production that doesn't travel abroad. It's increased a lot, the tax credit. It's been compensated by the tax credit. We have three kinds of tax credit. One is for foreign production coming to Italy, that is very aggressive. It's a 25% rebate. Another one is the cash rebate of 50%, and another one is 40% for companies that invest, that are not of the audiovisual world, that invest in production. This has compensated very much, the decrease of the direct investment from public funds and televisions. What happened also is that those, especially the external investors, tend to invest more in more commercial production, and this creates a problem for those films that are, let's say, more cultural, more difficult. That's why we are working to compensate that with direct funding, with a specific fund for those kind of films that are of value and are of important director, that can become the Sorrentino tomorrow, but on the paper they don't have a commerciality or a strong appeal for an external investor. We have very few co-production. The co-production have decreased dramatically. As a company, we have done many co-production in our history with Spain, with France, with Amenaber, with the Dardenne in Belgium, with Lars von Trier, with Anneke, with Alman, not with the UK, I must say. But the reason why we succeeded to do it, because we are also distributors, and we were able to kind of finance our part, because it was very difficult, if not impossible, lately, with the decrease of investment from television and direct funding, to find money for co-production, because the money has been mostly concentrated for Italian production. So this is something that is an issue, and it's very much an issue these days. We are talking a lot about that, and it's one of the main things where we are working on, and there are some investment really that coming from both the Cultural Ministry and the Ministry of Economy to improve and facilitate internationalization of company, meaning interchange and co-production. That's why one of the reasons why we don't often are in Europe, because many producers that are not distributors are not able to fund themselves and get access to the Euromatch fund. So this is a little bit the situation, and as I said, this is the limit and the peculiarity of our country. These two big broadcasters that control the majority of the local production, not being so they're interested to foreign markets. Mostly the interest is their domestic. And the fact that, as I said, very little few co-production, that means that our production is a good market share, but mostly on a national production and with domestic aim, let's say.
Thank you. We switch to Poland, and as I've illustrated, Poland has a very strong system of mandatory contribution by broadcasters, but also cable operators and pay TV operators. So, Jacek, could you explain a bit, now after 10 years, how this is perceived in Poland? And of course, we have to remember that the Polish filmography has a great success last year with Ida, was a success in the theaters, but also winning some Oscar, winning some awards at the European Film Academy, and this is some kind of renewal, right, in the Polish filmography.
Well, last Monday I had a very rewarding moment. We had a gala celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Polish Film Institute, and several people spoke about the institute. And the president of a commercial television said that the tax, the levy that he is paying, is the sweetest tax that he has ever paid. And although he fought against the Polish Film Institute, against the law, now he will risk his head to defend it. So that illustrates that from the very beginning, we wanted to have the payers to be a part, not someone from the outside, but a part of the institute. We put on the board of institute representatives of all payers. And as well cable operators. I will just say that our budget that comes from the levy is 30 million euro a year, out of which 2.5 million euro comes from the exhibitors, 12 million come from commercial televisions, 48 digital platforms, and 5 million euro from cable operators. And the cable operators were the strongest, they were very strongly opposing, saying that in no other European countries, nowhere in the world, the cable operators have to pay for that. Well, we found that in Belgium, and that was the only pillar on which we could put our argument. It was very. I say that from the very beginning it was our policy, because I remember the opposition. I was, when we were working on the law in 2005. Agnieszka Olerowicz, our director, was the Vice Minister of Culture. I was the Director General for Film and Audiovisual Media. And we had to do the lobbying with almost all members of parliament. And we had help with beautiful actresses who were approaching the members of parliament, asking, "Would you want? Don't you want to have a film with me?" So finally, it passed. Though I must say that the Civic Platform, the party of Mr. Tusk, who was later the Prime Minister, was very much against it. They are very liberal, and they believed, and they still believe, that the culture should finance itself. And you know what the answer can be. Of course, those that pay, now they are proud of being a part of it. And all the successes with Ida, 2 nominations for our documentaries last year. The Silver Bear for Małgorzata Szumowska in Berlin. And the results of Polish cinemas. Before the Polish Film Institute was created, in 2005, there were 700,000 viewers on Polish films. 700,000. Last year, it was 11 million. From 700,000 to 11 million. So everybody wants to be a part of it, and they are very happy with that. The Polish televisions, all those money comes from the obligatory, mandatory levy, 1.5%. We proposed 2%, but then during the legislative work it was reduced to 1.5. But it's a lot of money, 30 million euro, it's a lot of money. And this is contributions, with the exception of Polish public television, who can either contribute or finance films itself, and it's financing films itself. We work only with a selective system, no automatic system. And as we wanted the payers to be a part of the institute, we wanted from the very beginning the filmmakers to feel that they are part of the institute. Therefore, we decided that the selection will be made not by civil servants, but by filmmakers. And it's a two-tier system. On the first stage, I'm talking now about feature films, though with animation documentaries is very similar, but for feature films, there are 6 reading committees in the first tier. And each committee presents 2 best projects that they had. Sometimes can be 3, sometimes can be 1. But all those projects selected on the first stage come to the next stage, in which the heads of 6 committees, they have read all what comes from the other committees, and they decide to whom give money and how much. Because the money that is being, we have 3 sessions per year. So the money is divided in 3 parts, and they know that they have 1/3 of finances, and they have to select the projects to whom they will select and how much money they will give. As a matter of fact, it's 85% of the whole money, because 15% is left at the discretion of the director of the institute to finance projects that were lost during the system, or to raise subsidy to a film that needs more money that it was selected, that it was awarded. And we don't have fiscal incentives. We are fighting from the very beginning to have them, but the different ministers of finance, particularly in the liberal government of Mr. Tusk, who had great advantages, but in his cultural policy, he's too liberal. His party is too liberal. So the ministers of finance, they're always saying no, because that would open the door to other demands from other industries. But now we have made a great campaign, press campaign towards the introduction, and we hope that next year maybe it will have it. Thank you.
Caroline mentioned the fact that 10 years ago cable operators in Poland were quite opposed to the law. Now, what is the perception of this sweetest tax?
Before answering, so I can keep the suspense about what will be the answer to that question. I quickly would like to give a brief overview of how cable operators see the market evolving. It's really great that I'm in Cannes today and can listen and hear what your concerns are, but it's also good, obviously, that you can hear a little bit what our concerns are in general with the market. So You will probably all know that the market is television market and broadband market where we are active in are moving fast. And we are facing competition not just by traditional players, but increasingly from device manufacturers or OTT players. So it's a complex market we're playing in. And on the other hand, you have big telco operators who have entered the market as well. So we have to keep fit and make sure that we don't lose our customers. Now, what happens with the customers is that their usage habits have totally changed. They're not just watching TV anymore, they're actually in control. They know what they want to watch and when they want to watch content. And it's a total change of paradigm also for us. So more competition, more, I would say, very demanding viewers means that we as cable operators have to innovate. We have to invest in the networks, of course, but we also have to invest in new tools that allow to recommend content, that allows them to search all this vast amount of content that is available and make sure, you know, that they look at what is relevant to them, that they watch the films that are relevant to them, because that is how we will keep them as a customer. Now, we're very much in the business of building the networks, the infrastructure, so I think that's why we're not so often in Cannes. We're actually digging up the trenches and putting splitters and amplifiers in the network, so it's a totally different of activity. But there is obviously a very close link to our sectors. Now, one of our activities, and which is very successful, is delivering broadband services, and the networks have to be upgraded because a vast majority of the traffic on the internet today is video. I know it's not just feature films, it's mainly also short films and very short videos. But for example, Netflix, I don't know if you're aware of this statistics, Netflix at peak hour in the United States uses 30% of the internet traffic. So that gives you a little bit the idea of the pressure that is on the networks themselves to upgrade and to give a good quality experience. Now we're investing because of competition, because of the explosion of traffic on the internet. We're investing sort of 20 to 25% of our revenues each year back into the networks. If we don't do that, we lose the competitive game and we have unsatisfied customers. I think maybe I also would like to highlight, if I still may, because I'm a little bit out of scope, but I think you'll understand why I'm bringing these points to you, is that like the cinema, with our broadband services, we are considered not just as a service of economic interest, but also of general interest. So there is increasingly pressure on cable operators and other network operators to give good quality, high-speed, ultra-speed broadband, and also to roll out these networks in areas where it is commercially not viable to roll out these networks. So currently in Brussels, there is a lot of talk on how to incentivize these investments, and I think it was interesting to highlight that that kind of pressure is on our sector right now. Now, to come back to your question, which I hope you'll be interested to hear my answer. It is true that when a tax is imposed on anyone, I mean on you or on any company, you're obviously not happy with that. You fight against it with your rational arguments, or you fight against it with all the elements you can have. Unfortunately, we do not have actresses or actors to accompany us to meet ministers or MEPs, but we try to do a good job, nevertheless, in explaining why a tax is not a good idea. Now, I must admit that it is true that where the tax now exists, so I think we have had this beautiful overview of where the different contributions, mandatory contributions were made. Cable operators can live with it. It is true, it's not the biggest the biggest contribution they're having to make if you compare the investments they make in the networks and other taxes they have to pay. So it is fair to say we can live with it, but there are a few messages I would like to bring forward here. Often the contribution that is made to the fund is not transparent, so there is little information available of what happens with the funds we contribute to. I've read various reports preparing for this event, and it seems that the bulk of the money goes to production, not as much to marketing and distribution of the films. So maybe a shift is needed there. The other thing is that because there is this variety of competition on the marketplace, the funds or the contributions are not always fair, and not only for those who are active and where the headquarters are based in the country in question, but also because some players have their residence or have their headquarters in another country, so they don't contribute to the fund. And then sometimes the way the contributions are calculated are a bit complex. It needs quite a lot of reporting from the cable operator, so that is obviously not helpful because you have operational costs that you have to support. So I think our plea would be that if you have mandatory contributions, make sure they are transparent, equitable, and maybe also look at possible incentives, like we've heard from the previous speakers, fiscal incentives, which maybe could be a better solution in terms of the equitable distribution of the burden. Thank you.
So far we have concentrated more on a national financing system, but we have the chance in Europe to have two major organizations supporting the film industry, the Council of Europe with Eurimage. Hello to Roberto, sorry that you were not in part of the panel today.
Thank God.
And we have, of course, the Creative Europe program from the European Union, and Lucia will introduce the state of the art.
So thank you very much, Andrea, and thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here with you today. It's my first Cannes, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. So I will outline the role of the Commission as a European funding body in support of the audiovisual industry at large. I know that many of you are familiar, very, very familiar, and I hope you are many beneficiaries of the Creative Europe Media program. But I would like just to flag a couple of interesting developments that have happened in the media program since the adoption of the Creative Europe program. And I will start, media has a budget of around 100 million euros a year, which is certainly not trivial. And I will start by outlining what are those activities that media perhaps is not funding. And primarily, media is not focusing on production. There are other institutions, other schemes that are focusing on production that are better placed to cater for that part of the market, that segment. So media is taking a very overarching view of the challenges of the audiovisual sector, and it's focusing around the whole value chain, from creation to really promotion and distribution. And actually, distribution is really the core of the program, because nearly 50% of the program goes to circulation of European works across the European Union. Media is supporting heavily films, but not only films, because it's also supporting TV, it's also supporting video games, and also we are supporting the exhibitors. It's a very important part of the program. And there is a new scheme that was recently introduced in 2014 that is quite important for us, and it's about audience development. This has been mentioned. We really need to find a new way of engaging with the audience. And this part of the program, while being small, it has a strategic importance for us. Media has been running for more than 20 years, and we believe that has been hugely successful. A tangible proof of the success of media is that more than 25 films that are in this Cannes edition have been supported in one way or another by the program. And what has made this program successful? In our opinion, the main success, or the main recipe for success, has been the ability of the program to adapt to a constantly changing environment. And this is part of the DNA of the program, and this is the main challenge and opportunity of the program, to strike the best possible balance between continuity of those schemes that are really having a real added value, but also innovating, and striking this balance between continuity and innovation is something that we are constantly doing, and we'll take advantage of the mutual review of the Creative Europe program to try to make the program as impactful and fit for purpose as possible. But I would like also to mention something that I believe perhaps is less known for us, that is also part of the Creative Europe program, and is not covered by the media, part of the program, but what we call in our jargon the cross-sectoral strand of the program. When preparing this new round of programs, we identified that one main challenge for creative industries at large and for the audiovisual industry was access to financing. There is really a mismatch between demand side and supply side when it comes to accessing the loan market. So, and as it has been mentioned by Jonathan before, the creative industries have a huge growth potential. Actually, they represent today around 4.5 of the GDP. And it has really a sector that is booming. And we have identified that one of the elements that was hindering the development and the growth potential of the sector was this inability to access the financial markets. And this is why under Creative Europe, we have set up a new cultural and creative sectors financial guarantee. This new facility will have a budget of 120 million euros, but it's expected to have a leverage factor of 5, which means that around, we believe, our ambition is that around 600 million euros in loans will be available to small and medium-sized industries operating in the creative sector. And of course, we think that there are very interesting opportunities here for the audiovisual and the film industry. This facility will not be implemented by the Commission because we don't have the expertise to do this. This is very simple. This will be done by the European Investment Fund that will be working hand in hand with financial institutions following a portfolio management approach. So one of the, I would say, the most interesting element of this financial guarantee is that it will have what we call in our jargon a capacity building component. What we have identified is that the financial institutions don't understand the creative sectors. They have difficulties to understand especially the intangible assets and how to value the intellectual property right. And this is why this facility will have a component addressed to financial institutions, providing expertise to the financial institutions that will be part of this scheme to help them understand how to value a business plan, how to value these intangible assets. And we believe that this can really help addressing this mismatch between the supply and the demand side. But in addition, us from the European Commission, together with the Creative Europe desk, we will be working with the potential beneficiaries of this facility. We really want to foster investment readiness. We really want to disseminate widely the possibilities offered by this new financial instrument. Another element I would like to signal here, this is not something isolated. You might have heard about what is called the Juncker Investment Plan, which is the flagship program of the new Commission in terms of investment and growth. And the European Parliament has proposed that the cultural and creative industries can also benefit to this huge investment package. This is still under discussion, but I think that shows very clearly the commitment of the European institutions, and I'm happy to see here Mrs. Costa, but to witness the importance of the creative industries and the film sector within it. So to sum up, through this grant, more traditional or more established system of media and these new investment opportunities, we would really like to encourage the sector to do a smart combination of different sources of funding. So combining, as I said, in a very efficient way, this grant system with these new investment possibilities that will be provided very, very shortly as of next year. Thank you.
Good news. Time is running. We have 10 minutes, so I would propose that I will skip my own questions to the panelists and give the floor to the room to see if there are any questions. No questions? Everything seems to be transparent, though. So if there is no question from the room, I will then come with my question to producer in UK and in Italy. You didn't quote major players in the digital landscape, which in a sense it's a common player. The satellite packager, Sky in UK, Sky in Italy, and in UK you have also major cable operators and major telco involved. Do you think that there is some, are there any debate in your country on the fact that they could be involved also in the financing of the production, not as broadcasters as they may be in some cases, but as distributors? And Caroline has mentioned the importance of equality, and it's certainly important to discuss on the question of level playing field between the different stakeholders.
I think in the case of the UK, and specifically in the case of Sky, I think that the new renewed schemes in the UK, which are bringing fiscal incentives, tax credits to the high-end television sector is important and has increased and does allow, I think, the UK to kind of increase the standards of its fiction output in reality to somehow be able to now compete with the excellent quality material that is coming out of the US. So I think, yeah, there is a role for the private broadcaster. There is a role for the cable broadcaster. There's even a role for a Rupert Murdoch company.
In Italy as well, I mean, the main pay TV is Sky, that doesn't contribute to the production before when you are financing your film, but they mostly buy almost all the Italian films. What we would like they do more is that participate to the financing, that is the more difficult and critical aspect for a producer. They are investing successfully in series, in local production. You know, Gomorrah has been a big success, and now there's a new one, 1992. So in series that have somehow cinematic language, and that is also, you know, let's face it, a competitor to our sector. You know, for the public, those series are appealing, and they often, rather than go to the movies, looked at those series. So there is not, as I said, involvement in the production, and that this is something we would like to put them on.
Still no question from the room?
Deux petites questions. Madame Caroline, vous avez dit que Netflix... Vous avez dit que Netflix représentait pratiquement 30% du flux sur l'Internet. Avec ce qui se passe Netflix en Europe, et on voit des positions pas claires, la Belgique, la France, etc. Est-ce qu'on peut expecter une position européenne par rapport à Netflix, parce qu'il est un petit peu symptomatique de ce qui s'en vient? Deuxième petite question pour tout le monde, est-ce que vous pensez que le crowdfunding, on pourrait y assister concernant le film? comme il en est le cas pour la presse? Est-ce qu'il y a eu des petits exemples concernant le cinéma et la production du cinéma, cet appel aux citoyens pour aider à la production? Merci.
Je vais répondre d'abord. Oui. Concernant la participation des plateformes OTT et la nécessité ou non de gérer cela au niveau européen, les débats vont commencer à Bruxelles, c'est annoncé, il y aura des consultations publiques, donc ça va être très utile, je pense. Difficile pour nous d'avoir une position sur laquelle est la meilleure solution. Je crois que ce que les câbles opérateurs essayent de mettre en avant, c'est que à partir du moment où une contribution leur est demandée, il faut que cette contribution soit répartie auprès des acteurs du marché qui font quelque part qui ont la même activité, pour que justement la contribution soit équitable. Donc ça, c'est notre point de vue de départ. Là, je vais m'avancer un peu à titre personnel. Moi, je ne pense pas qu'une solution européenne soit nécessaire, ou en tout cas faisable. On voit que les contributions varient d'un pays à l'autre, c'est très différent. Soit c'est une contribution, soit on laisse le choix aux opérateurs de contribuer financièrement, financer eux-mêmes des productions. Et moi, je trouve que cette flexibilité est bonne. Il faut laisser au marché le choix de la manière dont ils veulent promouvoir le cinéma national. Une solution européenne, elle risque, à mon sens, de diminuer l'assiette, parce qu'il y a des pays pour lesquels ce n'est pas une priorité et d'autres pays pour lesquels c'est une priorité. Donc, il faut une solution, mais je pense qu'il faut laisser le temps au débat à Bruxelles pour trouver la meilleure solution.
On the crowdfunding question, the crowdfunding question is an interesting question, and especially in the context of the recent Conservative victory in the UK. Perhaps our only form of film funding will be crowdfunding very soon, given the swathes of cuts that are about to go through the British Arts. But I like the idea of the people participating in works of art and in works of culture and things like that. And I think within your question, I'd like to explore something else. And it's something that I think we don't talk about enough as independent producers or as people working in the film industry. And that's it's all about our self-worth a little bit, I think. And how important are we to society and what we do? How important is art to society and what we do? How important is culture to society and what we do? And I think when we spend time talking about these financial fistful of dollars, things like that, we should also put it in the context that what we do, what we make, our culture, is important to the health of society. And therefore, as well, we should be prepared to pay taxes for it, which brings several things together that has just been discussed, I think. And I was sort of inspired by that, by the opening of Jonathan's, the quote from Mahatma Gandhi at the beginning of your analysis. I liked it for a number of reasons, but it goes, no culture can live if it attempts to be exclusive. And that is sort of a lot of what we've talked about today, I think.
Hello, thank you very much for...
Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Gabriel, I'm from Brazil. Actually, we have a lot of challenges ahead that are quite similar to Europe. But Lucia told something that is very common in our countries, that a problem of trying to foster investment fund and trying to foster the understanding of intangible assets funding. I would like to know a little bit more of what are you doing in terms of that?
What we are going to do is precisely as part of this financial guarantee instrument to have this module, if I can call it this way, capacity building, that will provide experts in different fields covering the whole value chain that will be made available to the financial institutions to help them evaluate the proposals and being made by the potential beneficiaries. So this will be an integral part of the mechanism that we intend to put in place. I have to say that this capacity building scheme was a very, very important element when we discussed these financial instruments with the Council and Parliament, and it's the only sector-based financial instrument that has been adopted at European level. And it was precisely one of the reasons that helped us convince of the necessity of these instruments was these capacity building instruments that were specific needs in this sector that needs to be addressed. So basically, in a nutshell, what we are going to do is to facilitate good quality experts that will work hand in hand with financial institutions to help them evaluate proposals.
So I think it's time to conclude. Maybe I will like to, maybe it is really a personal comment, a bit my champ du signe. It was my question yesterday to the content director of Netflix, and I had the pleasure to have also one answer from Harvey Weinstein. My fear is really, because Caroline, you mentioned maybe the solution are not European. The European Parliament in its report underlines the fact that with the fact that there is different level of regulation between the European countries. Major operators, and it's perfectly logic, are looking for fiscal optimization, and they're going to countries where there is no minimal obligation. And this, I think, in the long term, is really a threat for the various countries where system of mandatory contribution exists. Already in this country last year, the major operator have asked the minister, why do we have to contribute when our foreign competitors don't have to contribute? And so this is really one European question. I suppose this will be one of the major debates around the directive, maybe the next topic for the next year conference. But I personally think that this should be one of the main topic of debate in Europe. We have really to think, to be fast in saying that this pan-European or even international development of this kind of platform has, of course, a lot of positive aspects, including for the distribution of European films, but for the general ecosystem of film financing, maybe a problem. I think this should be discussed in the coming months and years. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much for the public for listening, and I hope that this was interesting for your understanding of the general European map of financing. Thank you, and see you next year.